My interest in doing a video collage explaining anti-authoritarian principles and ideas started a few months ago after posting 2 videos on YouTube in which I asked people questions such as, would you ever grant anyone the power to deny you the things you need to survive?
No.
Or to deny you the things you need to survive?
Oh no, that's just crazy.
No, not only would I not grant that power, I would fight any attempt to take that power.
Would you prefer to not have a boss?
Of course.
Now, if you had enough money to live comfortably the rest of your life, would you still do something productive or creative for the community?
Of course I would. Because you know why? The community is where I come from.
If you had enough money to live comfortably the rest of your life, would you still do something productive or creative for the community?
Yes.
Now, would you prefer to not have a boss?
Yes.
If you had enough money to live comfortably the rest of your life, would you still do something productive or creative for the community?
Absolutely.
Now, would you prefer to not have a boss?
Absolutely.
Would you prefer to not have a boss?
Yeah, who wouldn't?
I was surprised that most of the hundreds of people I asked said they did not want to have a boss or anyone with the power to deny them the things they need to survive, and that they wanted to do something productive and creative for the community without the profit incentive. I wondered what these kinds of psychological tendencies meant, what their origin is, and how they are being suppressed in our society.
Hierarchy as it exists in the family, hierarchy as it exists in the school, hierarchy as it exists in sexual relationships, hierarchy as it exists between ethnic groups. Not only class divisions based upon economic exploitation, domination which may not even have any economic meaning at all. The domination of women by men in which women are not economically exploited. The domination of ordinary people by bureaucrats, in which you may even have a welfare, so-called socialist type of state.
The first step to agriculture is the shift to control. It's the shift away from taking what nature supplied, the move to extort from nature, to colonize nature, to engineer nature, contains the other stuff. It's implicit. You will get to the genetic engineering and the total control sooner or later if you don't break that logic.
Where any other person would die of thirst in a few days, they live quite contentedly in this desert that doesn't look like a desert. They know where to dig for roots and bulbs and tubers, and which berries and pods are good to eat. And of course they know what to do about water. For instance, in the early morning you can collect dewdrops from leaves that were carefully laid out the previous evening. Or a plume of grass can be a reservoir. And if you have the know-how, an insignificant clump of twigs can tell you where to dig. Then you come to light with an enormous tuber. You scrape shavings off it with a stick that was split to give it a sharp edge. You take a handful of the shavings, point your thumb at your mouth, and squeeze. In this world of theirs, nothing is bad or evil. Even a poisonous snake is not bad. You just have to keep away from the sharp end. Actually, a snake is very good. In fact, it's delicious. And the skin makes a fine pouch. Sometimes Kiko tells about the time when he went to look for the end of the earth, and about the strange heavy people he met on his journey. In the mornings, they like to read the news. They can read that the hyena has a new girlfriend, that the cheetah has lost one of her babies, that the oryx is starting to migrate to the west. The older children teach the younger ones how to read all the gossip about their neighbors, the animals, because everything that happens in the Kalahari gets printed out in the sand. They're very gentle people. They'll never punish a child or even speak harshly to it. So, of course, those kids are extremely well behaved, and their games are cute and inventive. When the family needs meat, the hunter dips his tiny arrow in a brood that acts as a tranquilizer. So when he shoots a buck, it only feels a sting and the arrow drops out. The buck runs away, but soon it gets very drowsy and it stops running. After a while, it goes to sleep. And the hunter apologizes to his prey. He explains that his family needs the meat. The one characteristic which really makes the Bushmen different from all the other races on Earth is the fact that they have no sense of ownership at all. They must be the most contented people in the world. They have no crime, no punishment, no violence, no laws, no police, judges, rulers, or bosses. Only 600 miles to the south, there's a vast city. And here you find civilized men.
How much say we have over our lives? How much influence we have over decisions? How much say we have over our lives? How much influence we have over decisions? How much influence we have over decisions? One person might say, democracy. Our value for that is that we should have democracy, we should have majority rule. Everybody gets the same vote, we tally them up, 50% plus one wins. Another person might say, we should have consensus. Our value for decision making is consensus. We should all at least abide or sign off on any decision. Another person might say, well, I think that maybe the one person should decide. Somebody might say that. I actually say all three, and many other things. I don't think any of those are a principle. They're all algorithms. They're all methods of arriving at a decision. But they're not a principle. One of them is right in one context, and one of them is right in another context. When you got dressed this morning, you didn't say to yourself, we should have a majority vote of everybody who's going to be there on what color socks I wear. And that made sense. Because that decision, it was appropriate to make that way. On the other hand, if you wanted to carry around a boombox and play it in here during the talk, you don't get to decide that all by yourself. Why not? Because we all hear it. And the idea here is that people should have a say in decisions in proportion to the degree we're affected by them. Now, we're not going to be anal about this. It isn't to the 6th decimal point, but broadly speaking, people should impact decisions in proportion to the degree where they're affected by them. The name for this, I think, reasonably is self-management.
But they want leadership.
I mean, if the people want to be told, here's what I'm going to do for you, they're starting off on the wrong foot. They have to be encouraged to think for themselves what they want.
Well, to be fair to them, I mean, they did. They gave me quite a grilling.
Okay, that's good. And your role as a leader should be to eliminate yourself.
It should be to
eliminate yourself.
Maybe that could become one of my things. I could say that this country will be fully operational the day I become not king, but a citizen.
I think you get a decent society if, in fact, it doesn't rely on leaders.
So I'm just,
It's not saying that it shouldn't select representatives.
Well, maybe I can do that. Maybe I can get some, when I decide on, when I can get some kind of representatives, where I can delegate some responsibility for specific departments.
Well, what I would suggest is instead of you delegating it, that they delegate it. It should be the task of the people involved to determine what tasks have to be undertaken. But the point is, it's all from below.
And maybe I can use the internet, for voting.
It isn't just voting, it's also participation and discussion and interchange.
So regular meetings would be good. Regular kind of meetings where they can ask questions.
And come up with proposals on whatever issue it is.
Accountable to us.
In the barbers' shops were anarchist notices. The barbers were mostly anarchists, solemnly explaining that barbers were no longer slaves. In the streets were coloured posters appealing to prostitutes to stop being prostitutes. The anarchists were still in virtual control of Catalonia, and the revolution was still in full swing. It was the first time that I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying that it had been collectivized. Even the bootblacks had been collectivized. Waiters and shop workers looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Nobody said "Senor" or "Don" or even "Usted." Everyone called everyone else "comrade" and "thou," and said "salud" instead of "buenos dias." You saw very few destitute people and no beggars except the gypsies. Above all, there was a belief in the revolution and the future, a feeling of having suddenly emerged into an era of equality and freedom. Human beings were trying to behave as human beings and not as cogs in the capitalist machine.
A swift look at history reveals a colossal amount of evil and suffering in the world. Throughout history, people have tried to identify and understand its primary cause. Explanations have ranged from the corrupting influence of artificial institutions to the intrinsic wickedness of human nature to the workings of the devil and evil spirits, or of certain groups such as royal families, capitalists, communists, slave owners, atheists, deists, Jews, Freemasons, etc. While it would be impossible to attribute all the evil of the world to one cause, there seems to be a concept that is quite central to most manifestations of it. Hierarchy, a form of organization in which people or groups are ranked one above another according to status or authority. This is tied to a violation of a basic moral principle. Those who have or seek more power than others do not apply to themselves the same standards they apply to others. Obviously, one cannot say that all authority is evil, particularly non-exploitive, challengeable, and accountable authority that allows people to survive or grow. However, hierarchical authority is inextricably connected with the marginalization and disempowerment of those without authority, with a lack of control over their actions and destinies, and with the subsequent rationalization of one's place in the pecking order. This not only arouses instincts which predispose people to cruelty and indifference in the face of the suffering of their fellows, but it interferes with honest communication between people at different levels of power, and turns people into subordinates, following orders from above regardless of their effect on others. Given that evolutionary biology has proven that mutual aid is more important for survival than competition, it is not surprising that the massive structures of hierarchy and competition we've created in recent civilized history have now come to endanger our survival and that of many other species. In the modern era, if we count the number of crimes, for example, the number of people killed and the amount of money stolen by elite hierarchical institutions like governments and corporations, and compare it to the smaller criminals like bank robbers, serial killers, gangs, Islamic terrorists, etc., it is not even close. Furthermore, evidence shows that, contrary to popular belief, the institutions of power that shape the law do not restrain criminal behavior, but actually promote the alienation, violence, and socioeconomic disparity that create most of these smaller criminals.
It's a fair assumption that every flesh and blood human being is a moral person. You know, we've got the same genes, we're more or less the same, but our nature, the nature of humans, allows all kinds of behavior. I mean, every one of us, under some circumstances, could be, a gas chamber attendant and a saint. You want to distinguish between the institution and the individual. So slavery, for example, or other forms of tyranny are inherently monstrous. But the individuals participating in them may be the nicest guys you can imagine. Benevolent, friendly, nice to their children, even nice to their slaves, caring about other people. I mean, as individuals, they may be anything. As in their institutional role, they're monsters because the institution's monstrous. You know, you see a starving child and you can steal food from him and there's no policeman around. Very few people would do it. If they would do it, they're really pathological. I mean, there's some pathological extremes, but ordinarily people wouldn't behave like that. They do behave like that on a massive scale, but they're unaware of it. And there's a huge indoctrination system designed to make them unaware of it, and even to make them think that the starving child is stealing from them, so we're the victims. That's what propaganda and regimentation are all about, and it sort of works.
And how fucking dare anyone out there make fun of Britney after all she's been through?
And it erodes the moral character. It prevents you from looking at what you yourself are doing or what your leaders are doing and worry about somebody else.
And now she's going through a custody battle.
So you see that all the time. So the people can be very moral.
She's a human!
But they're acting within institutional structures, constructed systems in which only certain options are easy to pursue.
My name is Linda Pino. I am here primarily today to make a public confession. In the spring of 1987, as a physician, I denied a man a necessary operation that would have saved his life and thus caused his death. No person and no group has held me accountable for this, because in fact what I did was I saved a company $500,000 for this. And furthermore, this particular act secured my reputation as a good medical director, and it ensured my continued advancement in the healthcare field. I went from making a few $100s a week as a medical reviewer to an escalating six-figure income as a physician executive. In all my work, I had one primary duty, and that was to use my medical expertise for the financial benefit of the organization for which I worked.
Like one time I had a couple, and they were so happy to get, I'm gonna start crying. They were so happy that I took them through this application. And the husband was late for work, and the wife said to him, well, don't worry, baby, it's gonna be okay because we have health insurance now. And when I looked at the end of the application, I could tell they were both going to get declined because of their health conditions, and they were so happy. And I thought, oh God, they're going to get that phone call in a couple weeks telling them that they're not eligible for insurance. And I just felt so bad because I just really thought, and I knew, and I couldn't say anything to them. I just felt like crap. And that's why I'm just such a bitch on the phone to people, because I don't want to get to know them. I don't want to know about their lives. I just want to get in and get out and get done with it because I can't take the stress of it.
I said to my wife, we both are, sons and daughters of auto workers in Flint, Michigan. There isn't a single one of us back in Flint, any of us, including us, who ever stopped to think, this thing we do for a living, the building of automobiles, is probably the single biggest reason why the polar ice caps are going to melt and end civilization as we know it. There's no connect between I'm just an assembler on an assembly line building a car, which is good for people in society. It moves them around. But never stop to think about the larger picture and the larger responsibility of what we're doing.
Most of the evil in the world comes about not out of evil motives, but somebody saying, hey, get with the program, be a team player. When a person feels, I am not personally responsible, I am not accountable, it's the role I'm playing, or these are the orders I've gotten, then you allow yourself to do things you would never do under ordinary circumstances.
I began to feel that I was losing my identity, that the person that I call Clay, the person who put me in this place, the person who volunteered to go into this prison, because it was a prison to me, it still is a prison to me. I don't look on it as an experiment or a simulation. It was just a prison that was run by psychologists instead of run by the state.
I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior. I was surprised, I was dismayed to find out that I could really be that I could act in a manner so absolutely unaccustomed to anything I would even really dream of doing. And while I was doing it, I didn't feel any regret. I didn't feel any guilt. It was only afterwards, when I began to reflect on what I had done, that this behavior began to dawn on me, and I realized that this was a part of me that I hadn't really noticed before.
I feel so up inside. I feel really up inside. No, I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I can't say that. I'm up. I don't know how to explain it. I'm all up inside. Out! Out now! God damn it! Up! You don't know. I mean, God. I mean, Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside. Don't you know? I just can't take it.
The scene you just saw was at the end of only 36 hours into this study. Each day after that, another prisoner had a similar reaction. And so at the end of 5 days, we had 5 kids. Kids we chose because they were normal and healthy, having emotional breakdowns.
You put a uniform on and are given a role, a job, saying your job is to keep these people in line, then you're certainly not the same person as if you were in street clothes and in a different role. You really become that person once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick, and you act the part. That's your costume, and you have to act accordingly when you put it on.
It harms me.
Why?
I mean harms. I mean in the present tense, it harms me.
How did it harm you? How does it harm you? Just to think about it, you mean that people can be like that?
Yeah. It let me in on some knowledge that I've never experienced firsthand. I've read about it. I've read a lot about it. But I've never experienced it firsthand. I've never seen someone turn that way. And I know you're a nice guy. You know?
You
do you understand? I do. I do know you're a nice guy.
Then
I don't get bad because I know what you can turn into.
It surprised me that no one said anything to stop me. No one said, Carmen, you can't say those things to me. Those things are sick. Nobody said that. They just accepted what I said. I said, go tell that man to the face he's the scum of the earth, and they'd do it without question. They'd do push-ups without question. They'd sit in the hole. They'd abuse each other. And here they're supposed to have they're supposed to be together as a unit in jail, but here they're abusing each other because I requested them to, and no one questioned my authority at all. And it really shocked me. And why didn't people, when I started to abuse people so much, I started to get so profane that, and still people didn't say anything.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
As soon as I realized that 819 could hear this, I rushed to the room where I had left him. And what I found was a boy crying hysterically, while in the background his fellow prisoners were chanting and yelling that he is a bad prisoner and that they were being punished because of him.
Because of what prisoner 819 did, my cell is a mess. Because of what prisoner 819 did, my cell is a mess.
Well, I'm trying to comfort this young man, and he says, I have to go back. And I said, what do you mean? I have to prove to them I'm not a bad prisoner. And at this point, he said, no, you're not a bad prisoner. You're Stu, and I'm not the superintendent. I'm Phil Zimbardo. The study is over. And he kept saying, no, I have to go back. I'm not a bad prisoner. And so the reality of that prison was so deep that even when I'm giving him the opportunity to leave, his reputation, his image as a bad prisoner has to be undone, has to be reconciled. When we released the first prisoner, 8612, we brought in a substitute, but he came in halfway through. And what's interesting is, day by day, as the situation degraded, we all adjusted to it. That is, each day's level of violence, of abuse, was a platform for the next day. But he comes in now, and he's seeing these crazy things going on. He says right up front, I'm not having any of this. And they told him, you can't leave. They won't let you leave, which we never said. In fact, 8612 was the one who told him, they won't let you out. And so he says, I'm going to go on a hunger strike. I'm not going to eat anything. I'll get sick, and they'll have to let me go. And he's a skinny kid to begin with. And the guards go crazy because he's now the symbol of resistance. All the other kids are broken. If they're not having emotional breakdowns, they're like zombies. They're doing whatever the guard said. And for the next 2 days, every guard on every shift, their mission is get this prisoner to eat those damn sausages. They put him in solitary confinement. They make him hold the sausages. And to his credit, he resists. So he should have been the hero. He should have been the hero for the other prisoners. Instead, he becomes a troublemaker. The guards set the other prisoners against him. They said, if he doesn't eat the sausages, you don't get your visiting hours. If he doesn't eat the sausages, you guys don't get your blankets. If he doesn't eat the sausages, we're going to put your blankets in nettles and spurs, and you're going to spend hours digging them out. So they start jumping all over him. Eat the damn sausages. You know, you're ruining our life.
It happens that that's the way states operate. Some of them can get away with it, the more powerful ones. Most of them can't get away with it. Maybe they'd like to, but Luxembourg can't handle it, you know, or Andorra. But countries like the United States can. A powerful state does not want authorization because that weakens its power. If you have to have authorization from someone, you are not, you know, powerful enough to do anything you choose. The same reason why the mafia don does not want a court order.
Make it a week. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
Suppose some mafia don isn't being paid by some guy, a grocer or something. He doesn't go after a court order to get the money. He doesn't want a court order. He wants to send his goons in to beat him to a pulp, you know. That's called credibility.
If we were to leave before the mission is complete, it would hurt U.S. credibility.
If this little nation goes down the drain, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
I still think we ought to take the rights off now. I think we let drown people come down to us. Well, no, I'd rather see the nuclear bomb. That's everything. That, I think, would just be too much. The nuclear bomb, no problem. I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
So the Cold War, in effect, was a war of the United States against the Third World and of Russia against its much smaller domains in Eastern Europe. Each great power used the other's threats as a pretext. The major objectives in Vietnam are pretty much what they were in Cuba, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Congo, all around the world. They were afraid that Vietnam was going to undergo successful social and economic development, and as it's put in high places, the rot might spread to others. It might lead to ideological victories for the mode of socioeconomic development that they're pursuing. The virus might infect others, as Kissinger put it with regard to Chile. Well, when you have a virus, what do you do with it? You kill the virus and you inoculate the potential victims, and that's what happened. Indochina was killed. Not going to, maybe it'll survive, but it's not going to be a model for anything. And the surrounding region was inoculated. In the 60s and early 70s, the U.S. succeeded in installing brutal and vicious military dictators in every country. And that prevented the rot from spreading.
I always found when, in any discussion on war, inevitably, in any discussion on war, at a certain point in the discussion, somebody would say, oh, well, it's human nature. Well, first of all, from my own experience, and I still have to tell this to people because there are still people who talk about the desire of young men to go to war, the thrill it is for young men to be in war, to shoot their guns, to kill. And I thought about my own experience in the Air Force, and it was very clear to me, looking around at all these guys around me who were dropping bombs and who were killing people, that it did not come from inside. It did not come from, oh, God, how good it would be to kill some people today. There was no urge to kill, even though they were the enemy. No. What it came from was simply we had been trained. And also we had been told it's a good war. We had been told we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. It'll be bad if they won, it'll be good if we win. We've got to drop the bombs. And then when I got away from my own experiences and just began to study history and history of wars, something else became clear to me. And that is, wars don't take place out of the rush of a population demanding war. It isn't the population that demands war, it's the leaders who demand war and who prepare the population for war.
Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths, spent enormous sums, taken great risks to build and keep weapons of mass destruction.
Saddam Hussein is determined to get his hands on a nuclear bomb.
Nuclear weapon, nuclear weapon, nuclear weapon.
Active chemical munitions bunkers, mobile production facilities.
We know he's got chemical weapons. He's got them, he's got them, he's got them.
And it was clear to me from looking at the works of anthropologists, there were some tribes that were fierce and some tribes that were peaceful. It clearly wasn't a universal quality. It depended on the conditions under which they lived. And this guy, Colin Turnbull, wrote books about the forest people and the mountain people. And the forest people, the pygmies in the forest, lived under the kind of conditions which made them violent. The people in the mountains were living under different kinds of conditions, and they were peaceful. So, I just didn't see any scientific evidence. And also the word aggression is a very ambiguous term because you can take out your aggressions in many ways. You don't have to take it out by killing people.
But what we have in history is the fact that when surplus value develops, when there's more than a subsistence economy, you have some portion of the population that will do everything it can to enslave and to expropriate the labor of the rest of the people. And one of the things that's used in that arrangement is a very conscious instrument of control.
Don't tase me, bro! Don't tase me! I didn't do anything! Ow! Ow! Ow!
An organization that has a monopoly on the legitimate uses of force and violence. And that instrument is called the state.
They won't loot slaves' power. And with this, they don't get them.
And there's a current version of that, a crude version by Thomas Friedman, who says that McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, meaning the U.S. Air Force.
I was invited to Washington, D.C. to attend this meeting that was being put together by the National Security Agency called the Critical Thinking Consortium. I remember standing there in this room and looking over on one side of the room, and we had CIA, NSA, DIA, FBI, Customs, Secret Service, and then on the other side of the room we had Coca-Cola, Mobil Oil, GTE, and Kodak. And I remember thinking, I am like in the epicenter of the intelligence industry right now. I mean, the line is not just blurring, it's just not there anymore.
But don't you sometimes need big government to deal with big business, that in a sense there is a kind of balance between these large forces?
It's like saying there's a balance between two members of the board of directors of General Motors. Yes, there's some kind of a balance, but they're so closely interlinked and they're connected that they're, to first approximation, they're the same thing.
Of course, this doesn't mean that some governments are not better than others, or that governments cannot offer a certain degree of protection against market forces. It doesn't mean that the public cannot have a certain degree of democratic influence over government, or that they cannot have more influence over government than they do over totally undemocratic institutions like corporations. After all, most of the freedoms that we enjoy in the West have been the product of successful grassroots struggles, like the Civil Rights Movement, the Labor Movement, the Women's Movement, etc., which were able to influence and constrain governments, corporations, and other elite institutions, which subsequently took credit for the freedoms gained by these struggles. What it means is that freedoms are usually not a gift from above, and that when they are either incidental or they foster dependence and subordination, creating hierarchy.
Thank you.
Government, whether it calls itself Republican, Democrat, Socialist, Capitalist, Communist, or whatever, is a means by which a minority controls a majority, either by itself or in conjunction with other powerful entities like corporations. Here, the concept of property is important. Having property for personal use and need, like a home, a bed, a toothbrush, etc., does not require government, but when one's private property extends beyond those items to the means of production, like industries, large swaths of land, or any property that is not for personal use, then the need for government appears. When property is used to deprive others of access to the basic necessities of life, or when property is used to derive profit at the expense of others without having to work, simply by granting permission to use the means of production, then the need for government appears.
Till there be property, there can be no government, the very end of which is to secure wealth and to defend the rich and the poor.
The great and chief end of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property.
Those who own the country ought to govern it.
Government ought to be so constituted as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority.
Camarada Durruti, a los lectores del New York Herald les gustaría saber si ustedes, los anarquistas, se consideran a las órdenes del gobierno o si por el contrario están enfrentados a él.
Se trata de aplastar para siempre al fascismo, y ello si hace falta a pesar del gobierno. Tal vez un día no lejano, este mismo gobierno tenga necesidad de los militares rebeldes para destruir el movimiento obrero. Luchamos por la revolución, no esperamos ayuda de nadie. Les mostraremos a ustedes, los bolcheviques rusos, cómo se hace la revolución. En su país hay dictadura. En el Ejército Rojo hay coroneles y generales. Mientras que en mi columna no hay jefes ni subordinados. Todos somos iguales en derechos. Todos somos soldados. Yo también soy un simple soldado.
Se acusa a los hombres de su columna de haber caído en un cierto desorden. Caos, dicen algunos. Los militares profesionales tienen dificultades para hacerse respetar. ¿Usted qué opina?
Los burgueses siempre tienden a identificar la libertad con el caos. Hemos organizado el entusiasmo, no la obediencia. Cada hombre, cada mujer es responsable ante sí mismo y ante los demás. Esa es nuestra fuerza. Nosotros, los obreros, estamos destinados a heredar la tierra.
Con toda seguridad. Será un triunfo muy costoso. Descansarán sobre un montón de ruinas.
No tenemos miedo a las ruinas. Los obreros hemos construido los palacios y ciudades de España y América. Podemos volver a hacerlo. La burguesía podrá hacer saltar en pedazos su mundo antes de abandonar el escenario de la historia. Pero nosotros llevamos en el corazón un mundo nuevo. Y ese mundo crece a cada instante. Está creciendo ahora mientras hablo con vosotros.
Society could be managed without the state. And by the state, I don't mean the absence of any institutions, the absence of any form of social organization. The state really refers to a professional apparatus of people who are set aside to manage society, to preempt the control of society from the people.
American people are being asked to die and pay for this, and you're saying they have no say in this war.
No, I didn't say that, Helen, but Helen, this president was elected.
What it amounts to it, you're saying we have no input at all.
No, you had input. The American people have input every 4 years, and that's the way our system is set up.
It is only natural that those on top of a hierarchy will try to limit public input by creating conflict and division. That is, by promoting unity only as it relates to a uniform support for elite ideology and action. And it's only natural that violence and deceit will be used to suppress the freedom instinct of the masses. After all, if the subordinate majority ever unite, elite power could be jeopardized. In fact, not only do power structures create situations where we oppress each other, but they create situations where we defend and become attached to our own oppressors. In other words, those at the top of a hierarchy become part of us, like an extension of our egos. The most obvious example of a hierarchical power structure having this effect is the state. Worship of the state has become a secular religion for which the intellectuals serve as a priesthood. The more primitive sectors of society go further, fostering forms of idolatry in which such sacred symbols as the flag become an object of forced veneration, while God and state are linked in public ceremony and discourse. But the state is not the only major hierarchical organization with control over our lives.
Every institution provides the people who are members of it with a social role to occupy. And typically, institutions that are vibrant and have a lot of power will specify that role in some sense as a list of virtues. It's true for churches, for schools, for any institution that has power over people and shapes them.
One nation.
The corporation, likewise, it provides us with a list of virtues, a kind of social role, which is the good consumer.
Like the waters of a mighty ocean, people also represent a tremendous force, the understanding of which is of greatest importance to the American way of life. This force is known as consumer power.
The goal for the corporations is to maximize profit and market share, and they also have a goal for their target, namely the population. They have to be turned into completely mindless consumers of goods that they do not want. You have to develop what are called created wants. So you have to create wants. You have to impose on people what's called a philosophy of futility. You have to focus them on the insignificant things of life, like fashionable consumption. I'm just basically quoting business literature. And it makes perfect sense. The ideal is to have individuals who are totally dissociated from one another, whose conception of themselves, the sense of value, is just how many created wants can I satisfy.
These people are customers because they are willing to trade money for widgets. And all the customers take their widgets home to all parts of the country. Look at all that money the widget builder has taken in from the sale of his widgets.
We have huge industries. Public relations industry is a monstrous industry. Advertising and so on is, which are designed from infancy to try to mold people into this desired pattern.
Take, say, sports. That's another crucial example of the indoctrination system, in my view. For one thing, because it offers people something to pay attention to that's of no importance. That keeps them from worrying about, keeps them from worrying about things that matter to their lives that they might have some idea about doing something about. And in fact, it's striking to see the intelligence that's used by ordinary people in sports. I mean, you listen to radio stations where people call in. They have the most exotic information and understanding about, all kind of arcane issues. And the press undoubtedly does a lot with this. I remember in high school already, I was pretty old, I suddenly asked myself at one point, why do I care if my high school team wins the football game? I mean, I don't know anybody on the team, they have nothing to do with me. I mean, why am I cheering for my team? It doesn't make any sense, But the point is, it does make sense. It's a way of building up irrational attitudes of submission to authority and, group cohesion behind, leadership elements. In fact, it's training in irrational jingoism. That's also a feature of competitive sports. I think if you look closely at these things, I think typically they do have functions. And that's why energy is devoted to supporting them and creating a basis for them, and advertisers are willing to pay for them and so on.
Politics and Hollywood's images are linked. They reinforce one another. Policy enforces mythical images. Mythical images help enforce policy. Jack Valente, president of the Motion Picture Association of America, has said, quote, "Washington and Hollywood spring from the same DNA," end quote.
I think somebody fell off the roof. Maybe he could sing, but he couldn't fly.
If he dies, he dies.
You are late. 1,000 apologies, oh patient one. You have it then. I had to slit a few throats, but I got it.
Disney's Aladdin was seen by millions of children worldwide. It was hailed as one of Disney's finest accomplishments. But the film recycled every old degrading stereotype from Hollywood's silent black and white past. In my latest book, Real Bad Arabs, How Hollywood Vilifies a People, I looked at more than 1,000 films. Films ranging from the earliest, most obscure days of Hollywood to today's biggest blockbuster. And what I tried to do is to make visible what too many of us seem not to see, a dangerously consistent pattern of hateful Arab stereotypes. Stereotypes that rob an entire people of their humanity. All aspects of our culture project the Arab as villain. That is a given. There is no deviation. We have taken a few structured images and repeated them over and over again. The Arab image began to change immediately after World War II. There were three things that impacted the change. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in which the United States has unequivocally supported Israel. The Arab oil embargo in the 70s, which angered Americans when gas prices went through the ceiling? And the Iranian Revolution. If we look at the anti-Semitic propaganda of the Nazis, at its core is an identical type of economic threat. This economic myth even made its way into children's books. Sadly, the popular image of Jews in Nazi propaganda resembles the popular image of Arabs in some of our most beloved Hollywood movies. The only difference being that the Arab usually wears a robe and headdress. To solidify Washington's connection with Hollywood, simply look at the films produced in cooperation with the Department of Defense, showing our men and women in the armed forces killing Arabs at random. We suddenly learned that the little girl we've been sympathizing with, the very girl whose humanity and innocence may have broken down our stereotypes, well, she's no better than those other Yemeni terrorists. As a result, when Samuel L. Jackson delivers the key line, we're now on his side. Why does this matter? Because in the end, the massacre of even women and children has been justified and applauded. It's a slaughter, yes, but it's a righteous slaughter.
Sergeant Mack. Sir? Contact all stations. Mission complete.
The humanity is not there. And if we cannot see the Arab humanity, what's left? If we feel nothing, if we feel that Arabs are not like us, or not like anyone else, then let's kill them all. Then they deserve to die, right? We are at war with Iraq. We went to war in March of 2003. But didn't our entrance to the war, wasn't that made a lot easier, primarily because for more than a century we had been vilifying all things Arab?
Oh, I come from a land, from a faraway place, where the caravan camels roam, where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home.
The United States is not a totalitarian state, so you don't get a propaganda line. What you get is something much more subtle but similar, namely a vigorous debate within a framework of fixed and unquestionable presuppositions. And it's those presuppositions that are the propaganda line. So take, I don't know, say the war in Vietnam, or anything you like. War in Vietnam, the presupposition is, well, a quote from the left end, Anthony Lewis. We began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969 we found that it was a disaster which was too costly for ourselves. So therefore we should get out. That's the left. The right says, you're selling us out. We can win if we go in and fight harder. All of it assumes that the U.S. attack against South Vietnam was a defense of South Vietnam, that it was an effort to do good, and then we can debate the tactics. That's perfect propaganda. If dictators had any brains, they'd do the same thing. But what's interesting is the nature of the criticism. It's purely tactical. You know, you thought the tactics weren't going to work. They worked fine. So therefore, everything was right. It's the only question you can ask. We didn't ask that question about the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. Or take, say, the Russian invasion of, take, say, Czechoslovakia in 1968. Tactics worked fine. Didn't kill a lot of people. So what was wrong with it? Well, we all know what was wrong with it. You know, it didn't matter that it worked. It's irrelevant. It didn't matter that they didn't kill many people. What mattered is what they were up to. But that kind of question you cannot ask about ourselves. If you ask that about ourselves, in fact, you know, it doesn't even happen. But there's a whole just to prevent the heresy, even though it barely exists. There's a very impressive array of devices that have been constructed just in case the heresy of being honest ever arises. There are even terms that are used, like moral relativism. Moral relativism means we apply the same standards to ourselves that we apply to others. Or moral equivalence. Absurd notion, I think, was invented by Jean Kirkpatrick, as far as I recall, to prevent looking at ourselves. Or take, say, anti-Americanism. That's a notion that's used, as far as I know, only in totalitarian states. So in the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, to be anti-Soviet was a terrible crime. If under the Brazilian generals, to be anti-Brazilian was a crime. Were the Russian dissidents anti-Russian? Of course not. They were opposed to the policies of the state, in favor of helping the people. But in an intellectual culture that has no conception of democracy, it becomes anti-Americanism.
It is dangerous to cede to the Indian government or the American government, or anyone for that matter, the right to define what India or America are or ought to be. Nationalism of one kind or another was the cause of most of the genocide of the 20th century. Flags are bits of colored cloth that governments use first to shrink wrap people's brains, and then as ceremonial shrouds to bury the dead.
You say that what the media do is to ignore certain kinds of atrocities that are committed by us and our friends, and to play up enormously atrocities that are committed by them and our enemies.
Take a look, say, at the book that Edward Herman and I wrote on this topic. In it, we discuss three kinds of atrocities. What we called benign bloodbaths, which nobody cares about, constructive bloodbaths, which are the ones we like, and nefarious bloodbaths, which are the ones that the bad guys do. What you'd predict, if you think it through, is that our discussion of the constructive bloodbaths would be ignored, because to reveal the fact that the media welcomed huge bloodbaths, as they did, would not be very conducive to the interests of power or to the media. It would also expose the fraud about the apparent anger over nefarious bloodbaths. So you'd expect the constructive bloodbaths to be ignored. As far as the benign bloodbaths are concerned, you might expect an occasional statement, since it's, the fact that the media ignored the benign bloodbaths doesn't show such terrible things. It doesn't, at least they didn't applaud them. And as long as you can exclude the role of the United States in being involved in them, not terrible, maybe a few odd comments. With regard to the nefarious bloodbaths, what you'd expect is fury and venom over the fact that the media, that the fabrications over bloodbaths of the enemy were exposed as a fraud. And that's important, and that can be used. It can be used, in fact, to defame the critics. See, if you show that people are lying about the crimes of official enemies, you can easily distort that into a defense of those crimes.
It's a failure of the imagination, an inability to see the world in terms other than those the establishment has set out for you. If you're not a Bushi, you're a Taliban. If you don't love us, you hate us. If you're not good, you're evil. If you're not with us, you're with the terrorists.
It's not the case, as the naive might think, that indoctrination is inconsistent with democracy. Rather, it's the essence of democracy. The point is that in a military state or a feudal state, or what we would nowadays call a totalitarian state, it doesn't much matter what people think, because you've got a bludgeon over their head and you can control what they do. But when the state loses the bludgeon, when you can't control people by force, and when the voice of the people can be heard, you have this problem. It may make people so curious and so arrogant that they don't have the humility to submit to a civil rule, and therefore you have to control what people think.
You write in Manufacturing Consent that it's the primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, the first place to look is who is in a position to make the decisions that determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, the major
decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations and conglomerates and investment firms and so on. They are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones who have to be in a position to make the decisions. They have an overwhelmingly dominant role in the way life happens, what's done in the society. Within the economic system, by law and in principle, they dominate. The control over resources and the need to satisfy their interests imposes very sharp constraints on the political system and the ideological system.
When we talk about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
To start with, there are two different groups. We can get into more detail, but at the first level of approximation, there's two targets for propaganda. One is what's sometimes called the political class. There's maybe 20% of the population which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. That plays some kind of role in decision making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on. They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. It's one group that has to be deeply indoctrinated. Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything. And they're the ones who usually pay the costs.
All right, Professor Chomsky, you outlined a model with filters that propaganda is sent through. That's way to the public. Can you briefly outline those?
It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media, what we call a propaganda model. We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media. That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. Local media more or less adapt to their structure.
World News. In the soundbite that says that there's a beachhead.
I think 628 is a good one. Yeah, but I think 6 is a good start.
This is the operative soundbite for us. He's ours.
He's got a minute for all the time, so that's. I love this soundbite.
Okay,
and they do this in all sorts of ways, by selection of topics, by distribution of concerns, by emphasis and framing of issues, by filtering of information, by bounding of debate within certain limits.
2.5 minutes to air. 45 seconds.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in the society.
There is an unusual amount of attention focused today on the 5 nations of Central America.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that
you're self-censoring? I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Quite generally, it goes right through history, intellectuals have been servants of power. Take, say, the First World War. On all sides, Germany, England, United States, France, intellectuals were extremely enthusiastic about the war. There were a few dissenters, and the best known of them ended up in jail, like Bertrand Russell, for example, or Eugene Debs in the United States, or Rosa Luxemburg in Germany. Very small group of critics, some of them best known imprisoned, but most intellectuals were enthusiasts for their own country, and that's common, and it remains common. I mean, intellectuals write history, so you have to be a little cautious about what they say about themselves. We ask, what would you expect of those media on just relatively uncontroversial, guided free market assumptions? And when you look at them, you find a number of major factors entering into determining what their products are. These are what we call the filters. So one of them, for example, is ownership. Who owns them?
The major agenda-setting media, after all, what are they? As institutions in the society, what are they? Well, in the first place, they are major corporations, in fact, huge corporations. Furthermore, they're integrated with and sometimes owned by even larger corporations, conglomerates, so for example, by Westinghouse and GE and so on.
What I wanted to know was how specifically the elites control the media. What I mean is, I guess...
It's like asking, how do the elites control General Motors? Well, why isn't that a question? I mean, General Motors is an institution of the elites. They don't have to control it. They own it. You know?
Except, I guess, at a certain level, I think, like, I guess I work with student press, so I know, like, reporters and stuff.
The elites don't control the student press, but I'll tell you something. You try in the student press to do anything that breaks out of conventions, and you're going to have the whole business community around here down on your neck, and the university's going to get threatened, and, you know, I mean, maybe nobody will pay any attention to you, that's possible. But if you get to the point where they don't stop paying attention to you, the pressures will start coming. Because there are people with power. There are people who own the country, and they're not going to let the country get out of control. So what we have in the first place is major corporations, which are parts of even bigger conglomerates. Now, like any other corporation, they have a product which they sell to a market. The market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. What keeps the media functioning is not the audience. They make money from their advertisers. And remember, we're talking about the elite media, so they're trying to sell a good product, a product which raises advertising rates. And ask your friends in the advertising industry, that means that they want to adjust their audience to the more elite and affluent audience. That raises advertising rates. So what you have is institutions, corporations, big corporations, that are selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what point of view would you expect to come out of this? I mean, without any further assumptions, what you'd predict is that what comes out is a picture of the world, a perception of the world that satisfies the needs and the interests and the perceptions of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Now, there are many other factors that press in the same direction. If people try to enter the system who don't have that point of view, they're likely to be excluded somewhere along the way. After all, no institution is going to happily design a mechanism to self-destruct. It's not the way institutions function. So they all work to exclude or marginalize or eliminate dissenting voices or alternative perspectives and so on because they're dysfunctional. They're dysfunctional to the institution itself. They're acting within institutional structures, constructed systems which only certain options are easy to pursue.
And in fact, these options may magnify, in an institutional form, the worst tendencies of human nature, tendencies which would otherwise only be present in a small percentage of the population, psychopaths.
One of the questions that comes up periodically is to what extent could a corporation be considered to be psychopathic? And if we look at a corporation as a legal person, then it may not be that difficult to actually draw the transition between psychopathy in the individual to psychopathy in a corporation. We can go through the characteristics that define this particular disorder one by one and see how they might apply to corporations. The psychopath's relations with others are superficial, surface, very, very little depth, mostly style over substance. And the idea is to impress other individuals, to somehow put them in a position where you can manipulate them and so forth. And a corporation, I imagine, would be not unlike that in many respects. They would have public relations firms. They would be spending half their time and a lot of their budget on trying to present a particular image to other people. And this image is a very superficial, and you never really get to know the real corporation. You're going to see what they want you to see. A psychopath is also a grandiose individual, has a very powerful sense of self, believes that he or she is the center of the universe, better, smarter than everybody else. Corporations, I suppose, almost by their very nature, would have to adopt this particular attitude. If they took the stance that they were, in fact, inferior to every other company, they're probably not going to get very far. So I imagine that they would spend an awful lot of time explaining to others and to themselves that we're number one, we're the best. The psychopath is also very manipulative, tends to manipulate, con, and deceive other people to try and mold them into something that they can use. Remember, the psychopath is really a predator, and as a predator you're trying to groom and put your prey in the right position for where you can make some use of this particular object, is the way they would see them. Would a corporation be the same? To a very large extent, I would imagine so, because what you're trying to do is manipulate everything, including public opinion, for one thing. And imagine in a sales meeting where you're trying to get everybody pumped up, you've got to have to, raw, you got to manipulate them, get them into a position where they actually believe in something that they may not have believed in before. Psychopath lacks empathy, and this simply means that it's very difficult or impossible for a psychopath to put himself inside the emotional skin of somebody else. They may understand at some sort of superficial level that this person is going through what could be construed as an emotion by other people, but I don't understand what it is. This is a psychopath's position. Would a company or a corporation actually lack empathy? Well, maybe by definition they would have to. If you're concerned about the fate of your competitors and also the general public, you may not have profits that are so respectable. Lacks remorse is another characteristic that defines psychopathy. That is, having done something, you don't feel badly about it. Corporation, I imagine, would be much the same, unless one is caught. Now, a psychopath who is caught for committing a crime, the first thing he'll say is, yeah, I'm really sorry I did it, I feel remorse, but only when caught. And I imagine that most corporations will be much the same. If some sort of regulatory body finds out what you're doing, and if it's considered to be illegal, I would imagine that they would say, well, yes, we're really sorry, but otherwise they're not likely to do that. Psychopath doesn't accept responsibility for his or her own behavior. Usually diffusion of responsibility is the name of the game for the psychopath. Somebody else maybe do it. Wasn't my fault, it was fate, and I'm not really responsible. Corporations would do this almost routinely, I would imagine. In fact, they would have public relations personnel whose only job is to make sure that this image is portrayed to the general public. That is, yes, somebody else, it was fate, it was a political decision, or it was not, the market suddenly crashed and there was a war in some other place, and this accounted for everything. Psychopaths tend to be impulsive, but in a fairly controlled sense. That is, most psychopaths are not going to do things if there's an external control present. The psychopath standing on the street corner is not going to commit a crime with the policeman standing right next to him. On the other hand, if the policeman is not there, if the external control is not there, then it's possible that he or she will do whatever he feels like doing if he has a chance of getting away with it. Are corporations impulsive? It's difficult to actually evaluate this, but I would imagine so in some cases, particularly if the corporation is not well structured, if the rules of behavior and the hierarchical structure is not firmly in place, then it would be very possible for a corporation to act impulsively. Of course, if you do this, then you run the risk of actually experiencing fairly serious losses. Psychopaths don't have long-term goals. Most of the things that they're striving for are short-term, and could refer to as a short-term form of hedonism. And corporations, I imagine, are much the same way. In fact, one could argue that sacrificing short-term profits for the long-term potential of making profits would not be in the company's best interest. So almost by their very nature, they would have to lack long-term goals. Now, some corporations, of course, would have a long-term strategy, but at the same time, they'd have these short-term goals that are firmly in place. They've got to go to the next stockholders meeting, for example, and show that there's a profit. Psychopaths tend to be irresponsible, and that means that their behavior doesn't take into account what's likely to happen to somebody else. Their own behavior puts other people at risk all the time. This could be in driving, it could be in personal relations, or anything they do in their general life. And corporations, I imagine, could be irresponsible in exactly the same way. That is, in an attempt to satisfy the corporate goal, everybody else is put at risk. This could be other companies. As a matter of fact, I suppose one could argue that this is good in the business sense. I mean, if your competitors fall by the wayside because you are acting irresponsibly with respect to them, that's good, as long as you get some sort of goal out of that, some sort of benefit. Psychopaths also tend to engage in behavior that is antisocial or at least asocial from a very early age, and this continues on throughout most of the lifespan. And by this I mean their behavior is not necessarily criminal in the strict sense of the term, but in fact it's harmful to other people, other individuals. May not take into account the fact that your behavior is going to have negative consequences for somebody else. Corporation could be much the same, and this ties in with irresponsibility to a certain extent, that what they are doing with respect to the general public and to other companies would clearly be looked at, viewed as, or construed as asocial or antisocial. We just don't really care.
I was wondering what scheme, workable scheme, you would put in its place.
Me?
Or
well, what I would,
what would you suggest to others who might be in a position to set it up and get it going?
Well, I mean, I think that what used to be called centuries ago wage slavery is intolerable. I mean, I don't think people ought to be forced to rent themselves in order to survive. I think that the economic institutions ought to be run democratically by their participants, by the communities in which they exist, and so on. And I think basically through various kinds of free association.
I'd like to see a gigantic project of dismantling and just getting rid of all this stuff that rests on the destruction of nature, that separates us from the natural world, that has people on this treadmill to constantly work and constantly consume. It's madness. It's destroying everything, and it just has to go.
Here, the question of how much of our modern industrial society needs to go arises. Obviously, people should be free to choose less technological ways of living, but let's recall that science, technology, and intellect have not been devoted to stopping the destruction of nature, to enhancing workers' self-management, or to overcoming the onerous and self-destructive character of the work of society. It has always been assumed that nature and people are just there to be exploited for the benefit of elites, and it's always been assumed that there is a substantial body of wage slaves who will do it simply because otherwise they'll starve. However, if human intelligence were devoted to asking how technology can be designed to fit the needs of the human producer and of the ecosystem, instead of that of the profiteers, technology would not seem so negative. And if human intelligence is turned to the question of how to make the necessary work of the society itself meaningful, the results could be surprising. For example, much of the necessary work could be consigned to machines, which means that humans can have more leisure time or can undertake creative and interesting work involving intelligence, skill, human relations, and service to the community. The task of technicians in this system of participatory councils would be to produce plans in the same way as industries produce refrigerators or stoves. That is, to explain to the people who are affected that if you decide this, you're likely to get this or that consequence. There is, however, one impediment that we need to struggle against if we wish to avert self-destruction. That's the authoritarian and materialistic tendencies of our society.
If my sense of identity is based on what I have, on my possessions, if I can say I am what I have, then the question arises, what am I if I lose what I have? Therefore, the sense of identity based on what I have is always threatened. A person is anxiously concerned or not to lose what he has, because he doesn't lose just what he has, he loses his sense of self. That sense of identity, which is based on to be, is entirely different, because that can never be taken away from me except if I'm insane or in some peculiar circumstances. I feel, I see, I love, I am sad. The less you are and the less you express your life, the more you have and the greater is your alienated life. Everything the economist takes from you in the way of life and humanity, he restores to you in form of money and wealth.
God damn it, an entire generation pumping gas, waiting tables, slaves with white collars. Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
all 4,600 million years of evolution. It's packed, sealed, tagged, valued, and available off the rack. No returns.
Now, capital is debt. It's amassed wealth, which then can be used for certain purposes. Labor is a life. What is superior, things or life?
Death! 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 Death!
You see, it is the will of the people. The will of your slaves and parasites. How dare you speak of justice?
For 50 years, we've told them what to eat, what to drink, what to wear. For Christ's sake, Ben, don't you understand? Americans love television. They wean their kids on it. Listen, they love game shows. They love wrestling. They love sports and violence. So what do? We give them what they want.
We cannot let the terrorists achieve the objective of frightening our nation to the point where people don't shop. Where people don't shop.
What do you find more satisfying, working or shopping?
Shopping.
Thank you.
You? Shopping.
I see. Look at all those bags.
Definitely shopping.
People don't shop. We cannot let the terrorists achieve.
What do you find more satisfying, working or shopping?
Shopping. Of course.
Shopping. Oh, that's a difficult one. Shopping.
9 years of shopping.
People don't shop.
Shopping, definitely. Work sucks.
Can I ask you a quick question for school?
Frightening our nation.
What do you find more satisfying, working or shopping?
You know shopping, of course. You know that.
Shopping.
Shopping, without doubt. That's an easy question.
Shopping, of course.
Shopping, definitely.
Absolutely, shopping. Shopping. Shopping.
Shopping.
Shopping.
Shopping.
Shopping. Shopping. Shopping.
I have to work in order to shop. They go together. Well, I work so I can shop.
I like working so that I have the money to shop.
Obviously shopping, but you gotta work so you can shop.
Our Great War is a spiritual war. Our Great Depression is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. We're slowly learning that fact.
That's all very well, Mr. Hammer. We haven't been paid in 2 weeks, and we want our wages.
Wages? You want to be wage slaves? Answer me that. No, of course not. Well, what makes wage slaves? Wages. I want you to be free.
Excuse me, sir, are you going to work because you want to or because you want to pay the bills?
Just because I wanted to.
Because you want to?
Yeah, at least I had to.
Because you have to pay the bills?
Yeah, just because I had to pay the bills.
I want to pay the bills.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
To pay the bills.
I gotta pay the bills, so that means I have to go to work.
You have to pay the bills.
Sorry, I'm retired.
Oh, okay. What about when you were working? Did you go to work because you had to, because you had to pay the bills?
I had to.
Paying the bills.
What do you think?
Bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills.
Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills.
Pay the bills. Pay the bills.
Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay the bills. Pay
Oh, the bills, always the bills.
See that? I keep them dancing for their money. Yeah.
to inquire and to create, these are the centers around which all human pursuits more or less directly revolve. All moral culture springs solely and immediately from the inner life of the soul and can never be produced by external and artificial contrivances. The cultivation of the understanding, as of any of man's other faculties, is generally achieved by his own activity, his own ingenuity, or his own methods of using the discoveries of others. Man never regards what he possesses as so much his own as what he does. And the laborer who tends a garden is perhaps in a truer sense its owner than the listless voluptuary who enjoys its fruits. And since truly human action is that which flows from inner impulse, it seems as if all peasants and craftsmen might be elevated into artists. That is, men who love their labor for its own sake, improve it by their own plastic genius and inventive skill, and thereby cultivate their intellect, ennoble their character, and exalt and refine their pleasures. A higher form of society in which labor has become not only a means of life, but also the highest want in life. Whatever does not spring from a man's free choice, or is only the result of instruction and guidance, does not enter into his very being, but remains alien to his true nature. He does not perform it with truly human energies, but merely with mechanical exactness. And if a man acts in a mechanical way, reacting to external demands or instruction rather than in ways determined by his own interests and energies and power, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is.
How far does the success of libertarian socialism or anarchism as a way of life really depend on a fundamental change in the nature of man, both in his motivation, his altruism, and also in his knowledge and sophistication?
I think it not only depends on it, but in fact, the whole purpose of libertarian socialism is that it will contribute to it. It will contribute to a spiritual transformation. Precisely that kind of great transformation in the way humans conceive of themselves and their ability to act, to decide, to create, to produce, to inquire. Precisely that spiritual transformation that social thinkers from the left Marxist tradition, from Luxemburg, say, on over through anarcho-syndicalists have always emphasized. So on the one hand, it requires that spiritual transformation. On the other hand, its purpose is to create institutions which will contribute to that transformation.
to love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power, above all to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget.